the requisite masculine characteristics. That is to say, um, they might have a feminine voice, they might not have enough facial hair, they might have a manner of speech and walking, that is to say, a gait which is feminine rather than masculine, and then you can be sure that they are body shamed. Likewise, with girls, you know, it might be the other way around. They might not develop breasts. They might acquire a voice which is rather, rather manly and masculine. Even their physique, they might be tall and have the physique of boys. You all may have heard the word tomboy, which was used in the past. But this is again a recipe for being body shamed. And with intersex people, the body shaming, of course, would start right at birth because they would be seen as freaks. So I think that body shaming is a political thing today, and a lot of people who don't follow this gender performativity model are body shamed. It can sometimes be so traumatic that it leads to suicide. And there are works of literature. I can cite, for example, a play by Mahesh L. Kunchwar called Holy, which was also made into a film, which is exactly what happens to this young man who is body shamed because of his femininity. At that point, one might not be out of the closet. So the world doesn't really know what one's sexuality is, but you're still body shamed on account of your lack of masculinity or femininity, as the case may be. The other day, I cited a Sri Lankan novel called Funny Boy, and that's exactly what happens to the protagonist at 6 years of age, even before he reaches the stage of puberty. He's body shamed because of his fetish for dressing in women's clothing, playing with girls, and so on. So this is something that one has to understand and keep in mind. Um, you know, how does this operate in day-to-day life? I'll tell you how it operates. You might go to a wedding or something, okay, where large numbers of friends and relatives converge. And then there might be, let's say, a young man there who's a bit girlish. And there are a number of, abusive terms that are used for such men. Sissy, pansy, faggot, right? Likewise for girls, the term butch, right? Terms like that. Dyke, these are terms that are used, even tomboy, for girls who are a bit boyish. Now, my point is that if you ever witness this sort of thing happening in social gatherings, you have to see, because you've done queer studies, that you put your foot down and come to the defense of this person who's being body shamed and not be co opted into body shaming the person yourself, as is very likely, you know. So, in a group of boys, there is somebody with a slightly feminine way of walking and talking, and you can be sure that he's ragged. In fact, a lot of college ragging, which is now, of course, illegal, happens on this basis. Also, let me say over here that, to some extent, girls can carry this off. If a girl is a bit boyish, the word tomboy, the old word tomboy, is not necessarily a term of abuse. And also that in terms of clothing, a girl can wear guys' clothes, right? She can wear tucked in shirts and trousers and so on. And it would be, she can even keep her hair short, and it will be seen as a fashion statement. But with boys can, of course, keep their hair long and wear earrings and so on. But if their mannerisms are feminine, then it's very difficult for them to, avoid being body shamed. And this is something that, as students of queer studies, I thought I must tell you. So, is that clear? Sachin, can I be heard? Can you hear me?
Yes, Raj. Yes, you're
Okay.
yeah, you're quite clear. And we will, whenever you feel comfortable, we will take a break of 5 minutes or 2 minutes, and then we could have questions or any comments from the participants.
What I do in class is that whenever anybody has a doubt, they can,
Mhm.
just a minute.
Okay. In the meanwhile, those of you who have joined recently, like
Hello.
who joined just before 2 or 3 minutes, I request you to put your audios on mute mode and also turn off the videos so that it's easier for us to
So, what
follow
would it be?
uh, the session.
No, no, I'm not. I'm not. I'm not. And please don't disturb me. Yeah, sorry. Um, Sachin, am I on?
Yeah, you're on, and you were saying something.
I was saying that what I do in class is that if at any point anybody has a doubt, you don't have to wait till I finish. You can always interrupt and ask your question so that it's out of the way. Otherwise, we might forget later.
It's a late uncle.
Thank you, Raj.
Yeah.
In that case, I'll request the participants to unmute your audio only to ask question or comment, and immediately after the question is answered, you could mute your audio again. Thank you. Raj, please continue.
Yes. Now today's talk is about queer history. So I'm going to give you a sort of overview of queerness through the ages, a little bit about ancient Greece and Rome, and then we come to ancient India and medieval India, and then colonial India, which is the 19th century, and then, of course, independence and after up until the 21st century. Um, so this is broadly the topics that I'm going to cover. You know, um, now in ancient Greece and Rome, and we are talking about long ago, about um, even the BC period, and of course the term homosexual did not exist. Incidentally, the terms homosexual and heterosexual are very recent. These were terms that first came into existence only in the 19th century. But even at that time, the word sodomy was known, right? And sodomy refers to anal intercourse. So, anal intercourse is what sodomy is. And in ancient Greece and Rome, um, sodomy was known, but there were fixed roles. The sodomizer, that is to say, the penetrator, was always an older man, and the sodomized or the penetrated was a boy, right? So it was um, a kind of intergenerational sexual activity. Now, the boy, because the boy was younger, and it is said that the boy was also, younger, and the boy hadn't fully developed into a man. The boy might not have even acquired a beard. The boy could be quite young actually. And therefore, the relationship between this man and the boy was that of master and slave. The master was a free agent, but the slave was not. And the master was always the penetrator. Foucault actually uses the four-letter word fuck and says that it is immoral for a free agent to be fucked. So the free agent is always the penetrator, the older man, and the boy is always the penetrated. And the relationship between them was indeed that of master and slave. So this is how it looked in ancient Greece and Rome. Obviously, here we're not talking about the politicization of sexuality. Obviously, there was no politicization. In today's terms, of course, it would be seen as exploitation and so on. But let me also say that perhaps pedophilia, as we understand the term today, probably has its genesis and its roots in ancient Greece and Rome. You know, um, so this is something that we need to keep in mind today. It's of historical interest more than anything else. Although, when I come to the medieval period, we do see that in the Islamic world, this um, this pattern recurs in the Islamic world, where an older man keeps a younger boy. You know, in English, there's the word catamite, and that's also a useful term. So the older boy keeps a younger catamite. This pattern recurs in medieval, not just in India, but in the Islamic world. And there are terms, the Islamic world basically consists of three cultures: Arabic, Persian, and then as far as Islam in India is concerned, also Urdu. So there are words, specific. They don't use the word sodomy, which is an English word, but they use the word launde bazi. Launda. A launda is a young boy, and this older man develops an interest in this young boy. But there's more about this that I need to say while talking about Islam, so I'll come to it at the appropriate time. Now, I want to move on from ancient Greece and Rome, of course, to ancient India. And ancient India is interesting because, there's a lot of our mythology that can be interpreted as being same-sex friendly, you know. Now, of course, we are not saying that they were gay in the modern sense of the term. Obviously not. But there is a kind of, first of all, there's a kind of sexual pluralism. That is to say, different kinds of sexual activity are recognized and they are acknowledged. And I think that the best evidence of this is provided by the Kama Sutra, which has chapters about how men and women make love and how to maximize pleasure. But it also has chapters which deal with the sexual practices of what it calls the third sex, which might be interpreted in terms of today's LGBT community. So it does that. So there's an understanding that sexuality it exists in manifold forms, and there's not just one kind of sexuality. So this is the this is the important thing about ancient India. Now, the mythology has several stories, which, as I said, can be interpreted as same-sex friendly. Nothing more than that. And as I was telling you the other day, Ruth Juanita cites passages from the Bhagavad Gita, more than one passage, where she talks about Krishna's relationship with Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, where he even says at one point that Arjuna is dearer to him than his wives and so on. And whatever he does, the miracles that he performs and so on, are because of his love for Arjuna. In fact, the entire Bhagavad Gita is his teachings to Arjuna when Arjuna develops cold feet and says that he can't fight the war which is against his own cousins. So that is one instance that is cited, the friendship of Krishna and Arjuna. Krishna is an interesting God because unlike the Islamic prophet and unlike Jesus Christ, there are a lot of things that can be said about his his affairs, his flirtations, Krishna and his gopikas and so on, and it doesn't offend people. That's not true about Lord Ram, but it's certainly true about Krishna. So then there are other relationships. In my own novel, The Boyfriend, I look at the friendship of Yudi and Milind in terms of the friendship of Krishna and Sudama, which again is an interesting friendship, of how Sudama goes to Krishna and he washes his feet with his own tears and so on. So that's another interesting example that one can give. Um, Vishnu and Shiva are again a case in point. Vishnu and Shiva are said to have had a full-fledged affair. And when I say full-fledged affair, I mean a full-fledged sexual affair that actually led to the birth of offspring. The offspring in question was Ayappa, and in turn, Ayappa also had a full-scale affair with a man called Babar. So this is all part of Hindu mythology. And what does this say to us? It says to us that if nothing else, ancient India was certainly queer friendly. Um, there are more examples that one can give. Devdutt Patnaik has a book called Shikandini. Well, he has several books, but this is an important book because it talks about one of the first sex change operations in the world, of Shikandini, who on account of a boon, and you have to read the story of Shikandini, I'm not going to go into it now, but the upshot is that Shikandini has a sex change operation and becomes Shikandi. So it's a female to male sex change operation, right? And if that is not related to what we understand of transgender identities today, then I don't know what is. So there's that as well. And then um, I told you about Ayappa and Babar, Vishnu and Shiva. Yes, there's Aravan. There's an interesting story surrounding Aravan, who was Arjuna's son. And somebody had to be sacrificed in the war, and it couldn't be Arjuna because he was important. So they decided to sacrifice Aravan. But Aravan wants to get married, and nobody is going to. No father is going to give his daughter to Aravan because the daughter will become a widow the next day. He wants to be married for just one day before he's killed. So then Krishna assumes the form of a bride and marries Aravan for one day. Now, the interesting thing about this story is that every year in May, that's only next month, but now with the lockdown, it's not going to happen. In a place called Kovagam near Pondicherry, they celebrate this in the form of a festival. And hijuras who can't otherwise marry, hijuras from all over India and trans women from all over India converge at this place called Kovagam, Kovagam, and they become brides for one night. So they dress as brides with all the bridal finery that they can think of dressing up in, and then whom do they marry? Now the interesting thing is there's a lot of young men who go there. Actually, this festival has a bad name because for that one day in May, it's a sort of free for all, and men go there, and it's really sort of sexual orgies that happen for that one night in hotel rooms and so on. So men go there and pick up their favorite hijra or trans women, and then they hook up for one night. Obviously, there's a lot of sexual activity, but then this is how that festival is sort of played out, where Aravan becomes um, husband for just one night, and Krishna becomes his bride. but the hijras, have sort of appropriated that festival and made it their own. So there's also that aspect. And finally, if you go to a place called Khajuraho in central India, in Madhya Pradesh, there's a lot of erotic sculpture. I'll just show you a relief. Just a minute. Can you see this? Can you see it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So that is Khajuraho, and you see that there are a lot of. It's almost like an orgy, and all the temples in Khajuraho. There's a series of about a dozen temples, and the sculpture on the walls of these temples is entirely sexual. But there are different kinds of sexual activity that are um, depicted in the sculpture. It's not just heterosexuality, but it's different kinds of sexual activity. So Khajuraho is also cited when you talk about uh, the same-sex friendliness of ancient India. We do talk about Khajuraho, about the Kama Sutra, about Shikandini's female-to-male sex change operation, about Vishnu and Shiva making out, and then Ayappa and Babar making out. And we talk about the Kavagam festival, and we talk about Krishna and Arjuna, and maybe Krishna and Sudama. So that, I think, is a lot of evidence. It's quite a plate full. Ancient India, what is the time frame? Let's say up to about 1000 AD, because up until that point, it was Hindu India in the Sanskritic tradition. From that point onwards, we have Muslim invasion. So this is how Islam comes to India. The first person to come to India was Mahmud of Ghazni. And that's a novel I'm writing because Mahmud of Ghazni was homosexual and he had a slave lover called Ayaz who was Turkish. And that's a new novel I'm writing, Mahmud and Ayaz, using that as a backdrop. But so it begins at that time. And then, of course, right up to the time that the British came to India, we had Mughal rule. Now they brought their own culture, of course, and um, suffice it to say that there was, there was same-sex activity that went on in different forms. Um, Let me say over here that I mentioned Mahmud of Ghazni, but there were others as well. Muhammad bin Tughlaq, Alauddin Khilji. I mean, there are same-sex encounters that all these sultans did have, and they were okay with it. The thing about Islam, I'm not an Islamic scholar. Salim Kidwai would be a better person. And if you read the book Same-Sex Love in India, of course, the entire Islamic section is handled by Salim Kidwai. So I think that should be uh, compulsory reading on your reading list. But I want to say over here that Islam is a bit ambivalent about homosexuality. On the one hand, the Quran is said to disapprove of it, and it recommends stoning by death as a punishment for people of the same gender who have sex, whether two men or two women. In fact, two men and two women are not even supposed to sleep under the same blanket. And this becomes the basis of much later Ismat Chughai's famous novel called Lihaf, which has also been made into a film. But more of
Raj,
that. Yes,
sorry to interrupt you at this
yes,
point,
sure.
but
Tell me.
Apurva has a question. If you could,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
if
yeah.
you would like to respond to this, he
Yeah.
says, "Does the presence and acceptance of queerness in mythology translate?"
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm reading his question because he put it in the chat box. He says that
Okay.
does the presence and acceptance of queerness in mythology translate seamlessly to the lived experiences of queer persons? Shall I ask him to some
No,
unmute?
not seamlessly, because as I said, um, this is about same-sex friendliness, same-sex acknowledgement, same-sex acceptance. Now, when you say lived reality, if you're asking that did they actually have hardcore sex, there's no, I won't, I will not answer that in terms of yes and no, right? Because first of all, it's too far back in history, and that's not the point one is making. The point one is making is that there is a same-sex friendliness, acknowledgement, understanding, and acceptance. But that now, when you say seamlessly translates into the lived experiences of queer people, what does Apurva mean by that? Does Apurva mean that were Krishna and did Krishna and Arjuna ever have sex? Um, I don't know. Did Vishnu and Shiva ever have sex? Yes, because they're supposed to have had a kid, and that child is Ayappa, right? So each mythological story has its own interpretation.
Yeah,
So have I
thank you, Raj.
answered, Apurva?
No, sir. Just sorry to interrupt, but what I meant was because there are these stories in Hindu mythology of gods
Yes,
indulging in queer activities. Did the
yes.
people who lived there, I mean, did it translate into acceptance for such activities indulged by people, like normal people, or were there punishments for them, like for common people?
No, there were no punishments. It was not. You see, when you use the term punishment, uh, something that is a crime is punished, right? Punishment goes with crime. And that is the thing that is said about Section 377 when we come to the 19th century, that same sex love is never a crime. And since it was never a crime, there was no punishment. As I said right at the beginning, there was a kind of sexual pluralism and different kinds of sexual activity. I mean, they were thought to be, part of um, human sexual activity. So there was no punishment, no. So have I answered your question? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, there was no punishment. The punishment comes only in the 19th century with T.B. Macaulay's um, Indian Penal Code, and I'll come to that at the appropriate time.
Yeah,
But
Raj.
just one thing, sir.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt again. But shall we take this as sufficient evidence for the fact that it was okay to be queer back then? Or is this too shaky?
Well, the thing about history is that history is interpretation. You and I were not there to know for sure whether all this actually happened. And as far as ancient India is concerned, it's not even history, it's more of mythology. History in a more concrete sense happens only um, after 1000 AD. So this is really part of the mythology. And how do you define mythology? It's like saying, did Krishna really exist or did Ram really exist? You know? So if you want to look at it in that sense, then no, it doesn't work like that. But what can and should happen in India is that this these mythological stories can certainly. help us to make out a case in support of modern homosexuality. Um, when we're ostracized, because of the shame culture, even by family and so on, because these stories are not that well known. If you talk about Krishna, for example, everybody knows about Krishna and his gopikas, or Krishna and Radha, and Krishna and Meera, right? But about Krishna and Arjuna, they of course know about Krishna and Arjuna, but they wouldn't be able to read it the way Ruth Vanita reads it. They know about Vishnu and Mohini, but not about Vishnu and Shiva. So this can serve as a basis, and but as I said, that um, these accounts are not that well known, and therefore it is imperative upon us to spread the word. As of now, there are only one or two books in India that deal with this, Ruth Panita's and Devdutt Patnaik's various books on mythology. But apart from that, there is not enough, studies that even deal with this. So there's more research that needs to be done, and that is the answer to your question, right?
Yeah, yeah, Raj. Just another question. This is
Yeah, sure.
from Dr. Preeti Oja. She wishes to ask you, what is the impact of historical references and myths on today's queers? And to continue with this, she says, do Hindu queers follow different belief systems than Muslim queers or any other religious community?
Well, each religion has its own rigid rules. Islam is more rigid, so of course, I mean, Hinduism um, talks about these things in a different way from Islam. That is obvious. But what was the earlier question? That was interesting. That can you just repeat the earlier question, Sachin? Can you hear me? Sachin, can you hear
So
me?
the question was, what is
Yeah.
the impact of historical references and myths on today's queers? Do Hindu queers follow different belief systems than Muslim queers or any other religious community?
Yeah, well, I tried to answer that, and I don't think that we make a distinction between Hindu queers and Muslim queers. It's just that Hinduism and Islam look at these things in different ways. I haven't spoken about Islam yet, but when I do, you will automatically see what the differences are. In the case of Hinduism, ancient India, it's more about mythology. In the case of Islam, it's more concrete. So that is the difference. And therefore, there's a stereotype that Muslims are more, and this is part of our Islamophobia, that Muslims are more prone to being homosexual than Hindus. So, but this is a stereotype that must be rejected. And the basis of the stereotype is that in the Islamic world, this plays out in more concrete ways. And you will see that when I talk about it in a moment from now. But what was your earlier question? Your first question? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Raj, shall I repeat the question which
The
she had
first part,
asked?
yeah, the first part of her question.
Yeah, okay. Um, just a minute. I think I lost the connection. If anyone can read the question which was asked in the chat box, it would be great. Dipti, if you can hear,
The
if you could read the question.
the question
Yes,
what
Dr.
is the
Oja.
impact
Yeah.
what is the impact of historical references and myths on today's queers?
You know, That's a good question. You know why? Because we suffer from myopia. And that is exactly what the British wanted. When Macaulay wrote the Penal Code, before writing the Penal Code, he introduced English in India. And while introducing English and authoring this document called Minute on Education, you know what he said? He said a single shelf of a British library has more worthwhile knowledge than everything that was written in ancient India in Sanskrit and other indigenous languages. So he was really demolishing all that body of work and saying that it is worthless in the modern world. Now we have inherited this, this myopia um, has successfully worked on us, and especially on our political class. So when our leaders today say that homosexuality is against Indian culture, you can see that they are victims of this myopia. And then from the political class, of course, it filters down to the common man. So that if you went and did a survey, if you went around with a microphone and asked random people, what do you think of homosexuality, you're very likely to, to be told that this is against our culture and it has come from the West and so on. Now, this is what queer studies has to do, right? This is what Foucault has called a distortion of historicity. And we have to set these distortions right. Even when the 377 case was being argued in the High Court and the Supreme Court, this evidence was presented to the bench, and even the judges did not know, right? So that is the answer to your question. You know the meaning of the term myopia, or amnesia, if you like, loss of memory. My friend G.N. Davy has this famous book after amnesia, but he's not talking about sexuality, but he's talking about the bhashas and so on, and saying that we must recover from the amnesia that was foisted on us by the Brits. And that is true. But who is to do it? Who is going to bell the cat? And the answer is that you and I have to do it as students of queer studies. And therefore, it's important to have queer studies. In my department, unfortunately, it is so shameful that after I left, they just discontinued with the subject. Because this is a very important subject also from a historical point of view. So does that answer your question? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I guess so. Raj, there is also a comment from Ashlesha. She
Okay.
says that as earlier we said that there are no solid proofs to provide evidence for homosexuality in India. So, I mean, I'm sure you made it very clear, and when you are talking about myths and reality. But I guess if you wish to respond to that again, you may.
What solid proof do they want? You want me to show you a picture where Krishna is having sex with Arjuna?
Sure, sir. Sorry to disturb you. It's
There
Deepali
is no
here.
solid proof of
Actually,
that.
shall I? It's
Dipali,
Deepali here.
wait, Dipali, let Dr. Raj Rao finish his
Okay,
comment,
okay.
then you could come in. Yeah.
There's no solid proof of that kind. Mythology is about what is handed down. It's received ideas, and that's the thing about history. That how can you be 100% sure of what happened? A lot of history is based on conjecture. In those days, it was not even possible to leave records and so on. But especially with ancient India, this is mythology by its very definition is not. It's not like science. It's not like 2 + 2 is 4. But it is there for us to take solace from. But you can't. This can't be proved. I mean, as I said, with mythological figures, you can't even be sure that they existed or they're purely allegorical figures and so on. So I've answered that, and I think that Ruth Vanita makes it very clear, in her book that she's not suggesting anywhere because when that book, when Ruth and Salim submitted the manuscript of that book to Indian publishers, they refused to publish it. They thought it was explosive material because this is exactly what they thought might happen. And this is in the aftermath of the satanic verses and all the hullabaloo that happened about that novel. So they thought that, people will say, and believe me, this happened to me in my own class. I clearly remember a student standing up and saying, "Sir, you are saying Krishna was homosexual." And I said, "No, I'm not saying that. And nor is Ruth Vanita saying that." So they didn't find a publisher. They had to go to St. Martin's Press in New York. But later on, Macmillan took it up and now Penguin has taken it up. But initially, Indian publishers were too scared, to bring that book out for this very reason, that if you're suggesting that our gods and goddesses were homosexual, the people are not going to accept it. So I hope that you read this in the right spirit. Okay, that is what you have to do. But now, if we just get stuck in ancient India, we won't be able to go further. So let me move on a little bit, and then we can come back to your questions. Now, I was saying, I want to say something very interesting about Islam, that Islam has always had an ambivalent attitude to homosexuality. On the face of it, in the Quran and so on, homosexuality, like other forms of sexual activity that are tied up with the business of morality, like adultery, for example. All these are punishable offenses in Islam, and the punishment is quite harsh, stoning by death by stoning and so on. But at the same time, Islam is a very, I'm using a word now, and you have to understand this word. It's a very homosocial religion. Now, what is homosocial? Homosocial is not the same as homosexual, but homosocial refers to a same sex or same gender bonding, and that is very prevalent in Islam. Now, I would need a full lecture actually on homosociality, so if we have time, we'll do that later. But homosociality sometimes becomes the means through which gay men might discover their sexuality. But all homosociality is not homosexuality. Now, homosociality, as I said, is same gender bonding. And to restrict myself to Islam, you can see that Islam is a homosocial religion because you see how men and how do Muslims pray. The men pray in public, the women pray separately. So the sort of mingling of the sexes doesn't take place in Islam. And again, we see how Muslim men in Islam greet each other, It's a warm embrace, hugging each other very warmly. And that, leads to a lot of physical contact between their bodies. I'll tell you something interesting. There is a Pakistani British writer, very famous, you should have heard his name, Hanif Qureshi. His father was Pakistani and his mother was British, but Hanif Qureshi was born and raised in London. He writes an essay called The Rainbow Sign, where he says that when he went to Pakistan for the first time as a young man, he had a culture shock. Culture shock not because Pakistan is a hot tropical country and overpopulated and so on, that he knew. But he had a culture shock because he saw how physical men can get with each other, which in England is certainly not possible. In the West, the West today has reached a point where homosociality and homosexuality, do not even exist as separate things. because homosociality can be about touch that is not sexual. But in the West today, I don't think that any touch can be divested from the idea of sexuality, you know. But in the East, it's not like that. And that is why in India, you see men holding hands and walking on the streets. Are all of them gay? No. Are some of them gay? Yes. But not all of them are gay. And this is what homosociality is about. So Islam is a very, homosocial religion. The segregation of the genders, men in one part of the house, women in another part of the house, and so on. So this is the ambivalence of Islam. Now, coupled with this ambivalence is the fact that in the medieval period, first of all, today I'm not talking about the literature, but there are poets who wrote very explicitly homosexual poems. Very, very explicitly the kind of thing that modern poets today would write. And they were writing these in the 13th and 14th centuries. There's Mir Taki Mir, there is Abru, there is Amir Khusro, very, very explicitly homosexual poems. So much so that a verse form known as the ghazal came to be seen as a homoerotic form of verse where men wrote romantic poetry to other men. This is the genesis of the ghazal, right? And then much later, towards the 19th century, another form of poetry emerged. I mentioned it the other day, called Rekti poetry, where men wrote romantic poems to women, but they assumed the persona of women. So it was as if a woman is writing a very erotic poem for another woman. This is Rekti poetry. So the ghazal, Rekti poetry, and the work of poets like Mir Taki Mir, Abru, Amir Khusro, and later on Firak Gorakhpuri, and people like that, very explicit homosexual verse, the homosociality of Islam. Then you have legendary stories, not legendary in the sense in which ancient Indian stories are legendary, because Mahmud of Ghazni was a real man. And, his in fact, the Mahmud Aya's love affair is spoken of exactly as you would speak of the love affairs of, say, Shirin and Farhad, or Soni and Mahiwal, or Heer and Ranja, So that is how it is spoken of. Though both Mahmud and Ayaz were men. So there's this self-contradiction in Islamic culture, right? But the point is that and then Babur, among the Mughals, Babur was, of course, notoriously homosexual. The point is that up until the Victorian period, when the British were here, none of this was seen as a crime. It may have been seen as an aberration, that, okay, some people are like that, and that's not normal, and so on. But it was not a punishable offense, even though Islam may have said that, you have to stone people and so on, and maybe that happened in some cases, right? But there was also this other side, that there was no law, against it. So this is the thing about medieval India. And then medieval India also had Hindus. So Ruth Vanita and Salim, they both talk about also forms of worship. Ruth Vanita says that bhakti is a form of, same-sex devotion. When Tukaram writes these abhangs, whom is he writing them for? He's writing them for a male saint, right? So the idea of devotion, again, devotion is different from lust. What we are doing over here is that we are, first of all, differentiating between love and lust, and we are interpreting love in a very broad way. right? Likewise, in Islam, there is Sufism. Sufism in Islam is, in some ways, the equivalent of bhakti in Hinduism. So there's that kind of devotion between the disciple and and God, right? Which is what is again commented upon by both Ruth Panita and Salim Kidwai. So these are some of the things that we need to understand about ancient and medieval India. The most important takeaway here is that whatever it is, um, love between two people of the same gender was not a crime. It was not a punishable offense, as it came to be later on. There was no jail sentence. There was no fine. Perhaps there was no social ostracization as well. And all these things came later in the 19th century. Right? Is this clear? Now, are there any questions here up to this point?
Um, yeah, Raj, there is, maybe this question doesn't directly relate to the comment that you made, but this is nonetheless a very interesting question from Prerna. She is head of the department in National College, Bandra, where you probably served for some
Yeah, I
months.
was.
Yeah, yeah. So Prerna has this question that what is the roadmap for creating awareness related to queer studies? Will it be too sensitive to add it to literature syllabi at the master's level, if not at the undergraduate level? I know this is a little, different from what you were talking about just now, but I just thought I'll pitch in this question.
No, of course it should be added to syllabi, not just literature, but even history. I would say that it should be. Why should it even be an optional subject as it is in most universities? Why not make it compulsory? And the other unfortunate thing is that sexuality studies are always clubbed with gender studies, so they call it gender and sexuality. And then disproportionate emphasis is given to gender, and very little attention is paid to sexuality. So I think it's about time that sexuality is delinked from gender. And as I was discussing the other day, Eve Sedgwick, Gail Rubin, all of them have pointed out that gender and sexuality are not the same thing. They may be related ideas. Obviously, they're related, but they're not the same thing. And I think that because of, why this happens because there's not enough expertise in our universities of people who can really do justice to queer studies. Whereas gender studies is older and, there's more material and a lot of people who um, specialize in gender studies. There are women's studies departments in many universities like Pune University and maybe Bombay University as well. But this is what needs to be changed. So the answer to your question is yes, but not just in terms of literature. I think that, when you guys now everybody has autonomy, and when you rethink your syllabus in BOS meetings and so on, I think there should be a paper called, for want of a better term, sexuality studies, or you could give it another name. This also helps because, in India, we don't have sex education at the school level or at the college level. So better late than never. At least when they come to university, if you have a paper like sexuality studies, it's not the same as sex education, but at least the issue will be addressed, and a lot of misconceptions will be cleared. A lot of as I said, the mischievous myopia of the British. The British were very mischievous, because they made sure that there's a disconnect between us and our past, and that was the design. That's what they wanted. They thought that our past was worthless, and not just in India. I mean, wherever they had their colonies, this is what they did, right? That they thought that this is called this is also called proselytization, that you convert people to your way of thinking. There were many good things about British rule. I mean, the idea of modernity and so on, especially cultural modernity, comes from there, and that is good. I'm not um, demolishing colonial rule. I would never do that because the fact that someone like me, writes in English, and English is my first language, and I have been teaching in an English department all my life. So I'm not going to run as the nativists do, I wouldn't agree with Devi and Nemade and people like that who say that don't write in English. So there are good things as well, but this thing about um, making us forget our past, especially in relation to sexuality, that is responsible for a lot of damage. And before it's too late, we have to undo that damage, which I think that scholars are doing in their own way. So that is the answer to your question, if I have
Yeah,
answered.
yeah. Thank you, Raj. And Adipti just has a quick question. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah, yeah. Good.
taking
It's more important to
your
ask
time.
questions than for me to just go on.
Yeah,
So,
uh, yeah. So her question is, do you think heterosexuality emerges as a norm since reproduction is essential for continuity of life and can take place in heterosexual relationship?
okay, now you're preempting me because this is exactly what Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code is about. So if there are no questions about ancient India, medieval India, the Sanskritic tradition, Islamic tradition, then I'll move on, and then I will come to this question that has just been asked. Are there any questions about Islam and ancient and medieval India?
Okay, it
Have I-
seems as of now there are no questions in the
Okay.
chat box.
So if there are some questions, you can ask me later. Now let me
Yeah.
come to the 19th century and colonial India.
Okay. Okay. Just take this last one. Um, this is Dr. Preeti Uja would like to know that. So, from the ancient Khajuraho's open sexuality to British ideas, closet sexuality, what is changed in the perception of our people? So, what exactly is the change, if at all there is a change, in the perception
I
of
think I've
India?
already answered that. The British made sure that that there is a disconnect between us and our past.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that is a
Yeah.
change because
Yes.
today, from the 20th century onwards, by 20th, from the 19th century, from 1861 onwards, we started to think that, first of all, this link between sex and morality, to put it in broader terms, I think that the difference between ancient India, especially in the Sanskritic tradition, and also in the Islamic tradition to some extent, and then modern India is that at that time there wasn't such a closely defined link between sex and morality. I think that is the what we've inherited from the Victorians. The Victorians were very prudish. I hope you know that. That they were a very prudish lot. Their own latter-day descendants would be embarrassed um, by their morality, because they were easily scandalized, anything scandalized them, right? And so this linkage between sex and morality is clearly a Victorian inheritance. If I ask you, I'm sure that for all of you, there is a link between sex and morality. And the question that you need to ask yourself is, why do we need this link? They're two different things altogether. Why can't we stop seeing sex as immoral? So that you do that, and then there are only very restricted forms of sexual activity that are permitted. And this is exactly what Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code was about. Now, the wording of 377 says that all sexual activity is unnatural and punishable by fine and imprisonment, right? Except, except, except sexual activity that is procreative, right? Now, procreative sex obviously is peno-vaginal sex, a man penetrating a woman vaginally, and that leads, provided he does it at the right time, that leads to the birth of offspring. So the Victorians believed that the reason, they thought that man was different from the animals. And actually, that's quite ironic because animals have sex only during mating time, not at other times. Just observe your stray dogs and cats and so on. They have it and they just have it during, when they want to mate, when they are in heat. But human beings can have sex at all times. Um, so this idea that human sexuality is only for reproduction is an extremely moral idea, not to say regressive idea. And 377 was, was formulated on the basis of this extremely restrictive and reductive idea that human sexuality is only there for the purpose of reproduction. Because with one fell stroke, they were just sort of rejecting the idea that sex is also pleasurable. So what later thinkers did is that, they juxtaposed two words, procreation and recreation. And they said, okay, sex for procreation is fine, but what about sex for recreation? And then there are lots of other intelligent and witty questions you can ask. If sex were only for procreation, why do we have condoms? Who devised the condom if sex were only for reproduction? And if people had sex only to reproduce? In fact, much later, I think the need in the world today in countries like India and China is that you have sex, but I remember when we were in school, there were these very hilarious stickers which you had to stick on your car. One of them was "Make love, not babies," right? That sort of thing. So this idea of sex being linked to reproduction is a very Victorian idea, and this is the basis on which 377 was formulated, Article or Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. It said that any man, woman, or animal who has unnatural sex, and then they went on to define unnatural sex as cunnilingus and so on, which is basically anal sex, oral sex, these non-reproductive forms of sex were punishable with a jail sentence and with a fine, right? And this was a penal code, so it was a criminal offense. It was not even just a civil offense; it was a criminal offense. Now, your question is that is there a link? I think that this is the first idea that needs to be junked. That sex is only for reproduction, because this is why the LGBT community has been stigmatized and ostracized, because obviously sex between two people of the same gender does not lead to childbirth. Though now I'm told that through scientific intervention, even that might be possible if it isn't already possible. But on the whole, it's not possible. And therefore, there's this social ostracization. If you go by that argument that sex is only to reproduce. And then, as people have pointed out, 377 doesn't only apply to the LGBT community, because even heterosexual people can have non-vaginal forms of sex, oral sex, anal sex, and then even that would come under the purview of 377. And then the other thing that they do is they club bestiality, which is sex between with animals, And I think that is also trivializing the argument a little bit. That because I don't think that human beings normally have said there is something called bestiality, and it's a part of perverse sexual activity. But to club bestiality with um, other recreative forms of sex that human beings have with each other, I think was pretty stupid on Macaulay's part. Much later, Baba Ramdev takes this up. And when the Delhi High Court in 2009 read down 377, Baba Ramdev went on air to say that, no, now you'll say let men have sex with animals. Right? I don't know whether he read 377 or not, but this is what he said and made a complete fool of himself. Um, so does that answer your question, or you want to ask it again? Sachin?
No, I guess uh, it explains, you know, well, yeah. So, Raj, now we have probably like 20 minutes or so.
Okay.
So shall we kind of continue the session and then take a few questions towards the end?
I will not finish then, and I don't know if we can have more sessions. It's fine by me because anyway, none of us is doing anything during this stupid curfew that has been imposed.
Mhm.
So I can have more sessions if you want, because I have not yet talked about the 20th century. But I want to say one thing, and then we can stop for now. I want to say one thing, and this is important, that in the aftermath of this anti-gay law, and by the way, this anti-gay law was not restricted to India. Wherever England had colonies, it introduced the same law, and it also introduced the law in its own country, in England. And then other European countries also followed suit. So that if you look at the 19th century, which was the age of imperialism and colonialism, because indigenous cultures had all been, colonized by various European powers. It could be the English, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, and so on. So all over the world, this is what happened. That same-sex love came to be criminalized, linked up with Christian morality, because these are Christian countries, right? And this is because Orthodox Christianity, the Vatican still disapproves of homosexuality. It's much worse than Islam or any other religion. So this was an Orthodox Catholic Church kind of idea that was being foisted on the whole world. Now, the important thing that I want to say is that what came along with this is surveillance. This horrible word which I keep using in all these articles I'm writing about what's going on in the world right now. Coronationalism is what I call it. And surveillance. So Foucault talks about this, that this gave a boost to the police. The law was already there. The law um, criminalized what it called unnatural sex. And natural was defined in terms, this is the question that the lady asked me. Natural was defined in terms of, whether the sexual activity in question leads to pregnancy or not. This is extremely reductive, that if a man and a woman had sex and the woman got pregnant, then that was natural, because it seems that is why nature gave us sexuality, to their very reductive way of thinking. But all other forms of sexual activity were unnatural. Now, so that was the law. Now the law, who executes the law? It is the police. So it's exactly what's happening in India right now in a totally different context. The police got the upper hand, and they started, hounding people left, right, and center, all over the world, in the Western world as well as in their colonies. The police got the upper hand, right? Police brutality became the order of the day. Now, this is what eventually led to Stonewall in 1969, but then I won't have time to talk about that, Sachin, so we can have another session. This is what eventually led to the Stonewall riot, of
Yeah, Raj, I'm sorry,
1949.
extremely sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
We just had a quick poll, and everybody says that please, continue the session. Whatever you have planned for today's session, we are absolutely fine to, you know, be around.
But
Even
then
if
it will
it,
go on for
yeah,
longer.
yeah, even if it takes some more time, that's absolutely fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I was saying that, you know, the surveillance that the anti-gay law um, led to, this is what becomes very scary. The law, the police, who are the enforcers of the law, and then the doctors, the medical fraternity, who were the people then who would give you certificates to say whether you're natural or unnatural, or because the corresponding word is normal, natural and normal, or unnatural and abnormal, right? And this gave the upper hand to doctors. So they also became part of this surveillance machinery exactly as they are now. If you hear mainstream media now, it's all right because everything is interdisciplinary. So we don't only have to talk about this. We can also relate it to the what's going on in the world right now. And if you hear mainstream media, you will be told that these are our saviors and they are being beaten up and so on by people. Have you heard that in the news? Say yes or no. Can they hear me, Sachin?
Yes, 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 Raj. You're
Yeah,
right.
so I ask
Yeah.
you a question. You must have heard that on television all the time, ad nauseam, that doctors are being beaten up. But
Yes.
let me point out that doctors are being beaten up because they are part of this surveillance machinery. They're not going as healers, you know. They are going to pick people and whisk them away to God knows where. Um, can you believe in Bombay right now they've created an open air, what do they call it? Open air sort of hospital in the Wankhede Stadium. You should see pictures of that. You know, open air. So people are just whisked away and taken there. Um, now, who does this? It is the doctors who will say, yes, this guy has to be taken away. And then the police will execute it. So this surveillance machinery is what Foucault talks about. He's really talking about France, but it applies to the rest of the world as well. Begins from that time onwards, right? Where the law is there, and then the police, the medical fraternity, they get the upper hand. Um, and it goes on like that because then, they, as I said, become part of this surveillance mechanism and people become victims. Now, this saw its high point, before we come to Stonewall, this saw its high point in Nazi Germany. In Nazi Germany, between 1933 and 1945, so this is a good 2 decades before Stonewall, homosexuals were persecuted along with the Jews, not sent to gas chambers uh, to the same extent as the Jews were, but of course, some of them were sent to gas chambers. Hitler and his crony Himmler, they believed that, they didn't like homosexual men because they say you fucking can't produce a child and we need soldiers to fight the war. After the First World War, they suffered a number of casualties and they wanted soldiers. And they said that if men start sleeping with men, how are we going to have babies? So they were, very homophobic. The real meaning of homophobia, to understand it, I think you have to look at Nazi Germany. So that is something that I want to say. Now, this, of course, needless to say, went on in other parts of Europe as well. But since we can't talk about the whole world, Nazi Germany is an important case in point where homosexuals were persecuted the way Jews were, not to the same extent, but some of them were sent to gas chambers. Some of them were in the camps, that is the concentration camps, where they were made to work so hard. What they called it is extermination through work. They sort of worked them to death. This is what happened to gay people in Germany. But then it went on in other parts of England as well, and this is what leads to the Stonewall riot. Now, the Stonewall there are a lot of studies on Stonewall, where in this district in New York City called Greenwich Village, there's a series of bars, and some of these bars where gay men and lesbians, quietly met just to sort of network. Obviously, in those days, there was no internet, there was no grinder, there was no, other dating apps and so on. And they met in bars. But the police did not even approve of that. So they started hounding them in these bars, and as soon as they would conduct a raid, they would storm into the bar. They would pick these people up, beat them up, black and blue, put them in jail, not release them. These were seen as non-bailable offenses. They would fine them. This went on for a long time. But then on that night, 26 June 1969, which in many parts of the world is celebrated today as Gay Pride Day, what do you think happened? The homosexual men, the trans people, the lesbians, they all ganged up and they said, we are going to teach the police a lesson. And when the police came, that night they came later than usual. Otherwise, they normally went there by 8:30, 9 p.m. But that night it was past midnight when they came. Everybody got together and gave the police a nice dressing down. They were beaten. They were thrown into the bar. The bar was set fire on. There was a lot of violence and bloodshed. They had to flee for their lives. The press arrived on the scene, and but the gay community won the day because the police suffered. They got a nice lesson for all the violence that they had inflicted on the LGBT community for all those years. Now that becomes a historic moment, a landmark moment that marks the beginning of gay liberation all over the Western world. So Stonewall is very important from that point of view, that this surveillance, reached its high point at Stonewall in New York, and then there was this revolt. Surveillance always leads to revolt. I've said in a number of articles of mine, which I've been forwarding to friends of mine, including Sachin, which I've been writing, that this surveillance, beyond a point, it will lead to revolt, right? And the revolt comes from certain quarters. In the present context, I want to ask a very interesting question. Why have they not sealed off Dharavi? They won't seal off Dharavi. They are scared. They'll give you excuses and say Dharavi is 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, so we can't cordon it off. That's not the reason. Dharavi is a volatile place, and if they cordon it off, there'll be a revolt. They've cordoned off Malabar Hill, which is very affluent, and there are docile people there, but they will not do that to Dharavi. So surveillance always leads to revolt, and the authorities sometimes understand this, and sometimes they are foolish enough not to understand it, because as the surveillance goes up, you're reaching a breaking point when there will be a backlash, and that is exactly what happened at Stonewall. So historically, the 20th, the 19th, and the 20th and the 21st century should be taken together, because this is a part of the world in which we live. And for us in India, it did come. It came later. It didn't come in the 60s. It didn't come in the 70s or 80s. But by 1990, we had set up the first support group. Hats off to Ashok Rao Kavi, who lives in Bombay, very close to where your campus is. The Humsafar Trust is at Bakola. You should visit. And against all odds, he started the Humsafar Trust, and he started the newsletter Bombay Dost, which was a sort of underground publication. I remember trying to find where it could be sold. It was only available in the Bina shopping complex in the basement, and that too, when you went there, they first checked your antecedents to see that you're not a spy, and then they gave you a copy of Bombay Dost. So it starts with Humsafar Trust in 1990, and those 10 years did see a lot of activity, which was very risky because the law was still in place. Now, the ironic thing is that after Stonewall, many European countries got rid of their anti-gay law, including England. England was the country that had introduced 377 in India, right? But after Stonewall, England got rid of 377. Now, that was the time when we too should have got rid of 377, but we did not. We held on to it because by then the myopia was so thorough, the amnesia was so thorough that we began to think that homosexuality is against Indian culture. So the entire past was forgotten, you know, and we started to think that it's against our culture, and therefore, just because they have legalized it, we don't have to do it. We held on to this law, and we held on to it right up to 2 years ago. But right from 1990 onwards, and I'm very proud to say that a man like me was also in the forefront of this, not in the way Ashok Rao Kavi was. Actually, there's an issue of Burr magazine of, I think, February 2019. Just check it out. And they have done a photo feature with 6 or 7 of us and said, how is it that in that decade between 1990 and 2000, when, you know, the NAS Foundation that filed this writ petition in the Delhi High Court, even that hadn't happened. And there was no question of India getting rid of this law. So we were all technically criminal people. Ashok Rao Kavi, there were other support groups later on, Gay Bombay, which you should read Parmeshani's thesis, which was submitted to MIT Boston, which is on the Gay Bombay support group, you know, which was a breakaway group from Humsafar Trust. You had the NAS Foundation in Delhi and you had Sangama in Bangalore. These were the main ones. But then there were other things happening on the literary and cultural front. Riyad Wadia and I got together and we made Bombay in 1996. Before that, I published in 1995 my first collection of very explicitly homosexual short stories. In 1999, Penguin India issued both Yarana and Facing the Mirror, which were respectively gay and lesbian anthologies. In 1998, Deepa Mehta made the film Fire, right? So all this happened, you know, in those 10 years. This was really like a renaissance. And believe me, we were all taking a big risk because we were doing something that was against the law. So when you look at the history, you know, I think that this has to be kept in mind that the revolution took place in the West. By the time it came to India, it was at least 20 years later, but it did come and we did do things. Then in the early 2000s, of course, the NAS Foundation filed this writ petition in the Delhi High Court. Initially, it was dismissed. Then they filed it again and it was dismissed a second time. And the third time they filed it, the Delhi High Court took note of it and asked the government of India what it thought about legalizing same-sex love. And needless to say, the government of India said that it is against Indian culture and the people of India don't want it, they don't like it. So nothing happened. But then we come to the year 2009, when very fortunately Justice A.P. Shah, who's known for his progressive judgments, was the judge who heard the case and gave a different kind of judgment, a landmark judgment, because he said that, okay, we will not scrap Section 377, but we will read it down to exclude consenting adult homosexuals from its purview, meaning that if there are two people in a homosexual relationship, which is consensual, and they are above the age of 18, then 377 will not apply to them. And that was a very long judgment. You can find it on the internet. But one of the key takeaways of that judgment was that we have to make a distinction between constitutional morality and morality in general. Because you see, 377, as I told you earlier, was a very moral way of looking at sex. And that is what we inherited. I think that a lot of Indians, even today, are as prudish as the Victorians were in the 19th century. You know, we are easily scandalized and shocked by anything sexual. But he said that there is a distinction that must be made between public morality and constitutional morality. And he said that constitutional morality means that every single human being, even if they are in a minority of one person, he did not put it in, in those words, but that's what he implied, must be given their fundamental rights, right? And therefore, we must amend this law, or at least introduce a rider by reading it down, and that's what happened. So this was in July 2009. But because it was a High Court judgment, it was immediately appealed against um, by various people. The case went in the name of Kaushal, but of course there were people like Ramdev and so on who were behind it. And then 4.5 years later, that is in December 2013, the Supreme Court reversed Justice A.P. Shah's progressive um, High Court judgment. This was just a two-judge bench, of which one judge, Singhvi, was to retire the next day, so he had no business to even be hearing the case on his last day in office, but they purposely may have given it to him, but that's what happened. And we were back to square one. Now, if you want a Supreme Court judgment to be reopened, then of course there are certain measures, certain provisions. One is review petition, which of course the NAS Foundation, and by then there were other support groups also that joined and they filed a review petition, but that was dismissed. And the other thing is a curative petition where you ask that the same case be heard by a larger bench. Now, miraculously, the curative petition came up. There was a five-judge bench. Ranjan Gogoi, who was the Chief Justice, was one of the people. He was to retire shortly. Now he's again earned a bad name by taking up this Rajya Sabha nomination. But at that time, he was a good guy, and you know, they saw merit in Justice A.P. Shah's judgment. Also, the previous year, some other developments happened. During another case, the Supreme Court pointed out that the right to privacy is a fundamental right, because that was challenged. You know, is the right to privacy a fundamental right or not? And the Supreme Court ruled that the right to privacy is a fundamental right under Article 19 of the Constitution. So then, you know, that sort of paved the way for this September 2018 judgment where hearing this curative petition, the five-judge bench said that, yes, we will read down 377 and it will not apply to consenting adult homosexual men, right? So, you know, what I'm trying to do is give you an overview of the history right from ancient Greece and Rome, and then we come to ancient India, and then we come to medieval India and colonial India, and then of course 20th and 21st century India. And I think I've given you all the major, what I would call milestones that we saw on the way. Um, Now, of course, we have to talk about the literature and films. So I'll need another session on, when is that? On 13th, on Monday. We'll do that on Monday. But this is the overview. So actually, we can now again return to your questions and take some questions about these things that I have said.
Right, Raj. So, yes, we will have a session on Monday, which mainly will focus on cinema and literature. Yeah, and mainly those of us who are really keen on knowing how exactly queer theory affects or changes our reading of whether it is canonical literature or canonical cinema or films in general. So they will have answer to these questions during that session.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now we have like say 5 to 10 minutes for people to ask their questions if they have any observations. But I'll request them to be as brief as possible. And one person asks a question at one time so that we, everyone is audible. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Hello, it's
Yeah,
Deepa.
Yes, Dipali, please.
Yes. Actually, my question, it's not a question. I just wanted to add to Sir's statement at point of time, but still I can add it. It was like related to ancient history
Mhm.
or mythology, Indian mythology. The characters whom were like the characters, those were referred by Dr. Raja Rao before.
Raj Rao.
Raj Rao, sorry.
Yeah, okay. You can call me Raja Rao also. That's my
Sorry.
Raja Rao Junior. You have to say Raja Rao Junior.
Okay. No, sir. Okay. So the characters like gods and goddesses, they were like they had that homosexual relationship, because as per my reading or the ancient history, Indian ancient history, uh, I sorry, I want to add something here, that yes, it is given, but why they were intermingled in these activities and all, it has a particular motto, with that particular motto or that particular purpose behind it, they
What is
might
the
be
purpose?
involved. I don't know that, but mm, I want to share
Yeah.
this thing here.
Yeah, thank you, Dipali. Raj, but I guess this is a very interesting point because whenever we cite examples from myths, usually it is said that every action had a specific, intention or intent and a noble intent. Without that, it didn't really. So it is a kind of way of contextualizing the actions and interpreting. So also a sort of strategy to restrict your interpretation of a particular action. What would you like to say, Raj, on this?
I don't think sex has any purpose other than pleasure or reproduction. One of the two.
Sorry to interrupt, but the
Vishnu and
story. No.
Vishnu and Shiva are said to have had, sexual union. What is the objective? So I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. What I do know is that the story is that Vishnu and Shiva, because Vishnu has various avatars. Vishnu also has this feminine avatar of Mohini. The other thing I forgot to say, which is important, is that in ancient Indian mythology, we have the concept of Ardhanareshwar, half man, half woman. You heard of it, right? And I think that these stories are really a way of um, highlighting that aspect that, in every human being, there is a masculine and a feminine side. Um, so if you have sex with, whether you have sex with the opposite sex or your own sex, um, it's the same thing because we have both sides. Every human being has both a masculine and a feminine side to their being, right? So I don't think that as far as I would think of these things, I don't think that there's a specific purpose. If you know what the specific purpose is, you can
Mhm.
tell us.
Yeah, thank you, Raj. There is another question. It's quite broad, so
Yeah.
I'll try to read it slowly. Uh, Prasanna Bacha wishes to ask, what kind of documents does a researcher study when they study queer myths or queerness in myth? That is one question. Second is, how does language or translation feature in the field if the native myths exist in native languages and not in English? I think these are two different questions. So if you would like to address the first question, and then I'll
Well,
repeat the
how do
second
you
question.
access? I mean, obviously, because we are dealing with a long time ago, there is not that much material available. So you have to research it. What I discuss with you is what is available in English translation, which I have access to. Because I can't read, for example, if there's some Sanskrit text, I can't read a Sanskrit
Mhm.
text. So, of course, I would depend on, but then the authors of the um, English work that I have cited, particularly the Ruth Vanita Salim Kidwai book, they have done a lot of the research on their own. And of course, that's a very scholarly work. So there is a detailed bibliography as well. And that is the right way to go about it if you want to read up on these ancient myths, because there are a lot of cross references given in their work. It's a tremendous work of scholarship, which I don't think can really be equaled by anyone for a long time to come. Um, Now, as for something being lost in translation, yeah, of course, that will happen. That is bound to happen. But I think they have been careful about that as well. You know, one reason why they call their book Same Sex Love is because they believe that the term same sex love is a neutral term, it's not a loaded term. It doesn't have any pejorative connotations. Like if you say gay, queer, homosexual, there are people who might be uncomfortable with these terms. So they are trying to be as descriptive as possible and simply call it same-sex love, which is about as descriptive as you can be, right? And not judgmental. So these are the issues over here that if you can read another language, an ancient language, and of course you're more fortunate because then you have access to original texts and you can verify. There may be some people who think that Ruth Vanita and Salim Kidwai have distorted things. I've had arguments with some Muslim friends of mine who say that Kidwai is wrong when he says that the ghazal was originally verse form that men wrote to other men. They disagree with that. Now that could be because of their own homophobia or resistance to um, same-sex love or whatever, but they vehemently sort of say, no, that's not the case. Because today, you see, the ghazal is different. Today, when you say whether it's Ghulam Ali or, Pankaj Udas or any of these popular ghazal singers, the ghazal is always sort of sung by a man for a woman or by a woman for a man. But Kidwai's point is that when the ghazal originated, it was not like that, right? So there can be disagreement. This is the thing about history that there is no one interpretation. There are different ways in which it can be interpreted. It's not like science. So that's the answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you, Raj. Okay, now Apurva has a question, and she wishes to ask. I'm sorry. Yeah, what are the possible relations between post-colonialism and queer theory? Uh, Maybe this is something that we will also be slightly focusing on when we have the next session on Monday.
Well, let me draw your attention to a book, a very interesting book published by Orion Black Swan. The author is Alka Anjairia, and the book is called Reading India Now.
Hmm.
Okay, and she addresses this question in terms of my own novel, The Boyfriend. And she
Hmm.
says that post-colonial deals basically with, post-colonial is the new word for Commonwealth, and it deals basically with, with issues of um, issues of issues like diaspora, immigration, race relations, ethnicity, um, tribal cultures. It deals with things like that. And then she cites an author like Amitav Ghosh and says that he's the archetypal post-colonial writer in that sense, that who's dealing with the historical past, not the distant past, the recent past, the post-colonial past, in terms of in terms of the effects of colonialism on indigenous people, on native cultures, and so on. So that is what post-colonial theory is really about. And if you take the most famous post-colonial theorists, look at the things that they talk about. Spivak talks about the subaltern, which is tribal cultures. Baba talks about uh, what does he talk about? Um, what is Homi Baba's? What is he famous for?
Uh,
Um, Henry Jameson talks about, not Jameson, yeah, Frederick Jameson. He talks about um, third world novels as allegories of nationalism. So he's talking about nationalism, right? Um, so, these are some of the things. Edward Said likewise talks about Orientalism, which is again the relationship between the Occident or the West and the Orient. Yeah, Baba talks about hybridity. That's what I was forgetting. So all this has to do with the relationship between the metropolis and the province. The metropolis is the erstwhile um, colonial power, which is the metropolis, Europe, England, America, and the province is the third world. So this relationship. Now, Alka Anjaria says that when you talk about gay literature, and she starts with boyfriend, I'll tell you what she says, something very interesting. I never knew, I never read my own novel in that way. But she says that now we have to use the term post twice and say that gay literature or queer theory is post colonial. And you know why? She says because in queer literature and queer theory, you're not really deconstructing the relationship between the metropolis and the province, but you're going beyond that and you're making sexuality the focus. Now, if you read my novel Boyfriend, she gives a very interesting example. Even I never saw it that way. She says there is a scene where Yuri has met Milind once at the Churchgate station loo, took him to his house, they had sex, but both of them were scared. They didn't give each other their real names. In fact, when Yuri takes Milind to his flat, it's not his flat, his mother's flat, he blindfolds him so that Milind doesn't see where he's being taken and come back there to blackmail him. And then they go away, and Milind, Yuri says, "Okay, I'll travel with you because even I'm going that side." But again, Milind gets off one station before where he actually lives because he doesn't want Yuri to know where he lives. Even so, he's vaguely told Yuri where he lives. Now, this happens, the year is 1992, when there were riots in Bombay in the aftermath of the demolition of the Babri Masjid. Okay? One fine day, Yuri decides that I'm missing Milind. I must find her. I don't have a phone number. I don't have an address. What am I going to do? He vaguely told me he lives in a neighborhood called Mahim. So he takes a bus, right, and goes to Mahim. Now, Mahim was a neighborhood that was heavily affected by the riots. Okay? So there is destruction all around. There's still the embers of all the arson and all of that happened. The burnt houses and cars and so on. But she says, Alka Anjaria says that if you look at Yuri, he's not like any Amitabh Ghosh character. An Amitabh Ghosh character would have concentrated on the destruction, on the havoc, and looked at it in terms of this relationship between metropolis and province, and maybe blamed the metropolis, blame colonialism for what has happened, because of course the British are responsible for dividing the Hindus and Muslims, and that is how. But he says Yuri is, he's interesting because, and that's true, Yuri tangentially notes all the destruction that's happened around, with the corner of his eye, okay, idhar gaadi jal gaya, idhar but his central focus is, I have to spot Milind. So he spends the whole day searching every face, every young man, who comes, okay, he might be my Milind, he might be my Milind. Of course, it's a futile search because can you find, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack, and he doesn't find Milind. He finds him later in a different situation. Even that is quite miraculous because he finds him in the Times of India office as he's coming down the lift, and Milind is waiting to go up in the same lift, and he grabs hold of him and says, do you remember me, and so on. So that's what happens in the novel. But Alka Anjaria has 10 pages of commentary on this scene. She says it's interesting because she says Naipaul wouldn't do that, Salman Rushdie wouldn't do that, Ghosh wouldn't do that, Jhumpa Lahiri wouldn't do that. For all of them, it would be the destruction. Whereas there is this character who's not worried about the destruction, he's worried about his sexual partner because he's thinking of that blissful moment when he had sex. Now he wants that again, and he couldn't care less whether, Mahim is burnt or the Babri Masjid was demolished. So she says that this is what defines uh, queer literature, right? And therefore she says, and then she has a lot of commentary on Chetan Bhagat also in a different context, not in terms of queer writing. Um, so she says that maybe for writers like that, we have to now, just as you have post feminism and post feminism, perhaps we have to call it post colonial. So this is the answer to your question that there is no direct. You can look at queer studies in terms of post colonial if you're binarizing it, because post colonial has to do with, if I say metropolis and province, I've created a binary. So you can use the same model and say, heterosexual and homosexual, and you've created that kind of binary. But perhaps it plays out differently. Okay, so that is the answer to your question.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you very much. I guess like we will continue to have these questions, but we have one more session that is on Monday. So I would request all the participants to join the webinar and the next session on Monday at 11:30. Yeah, Raj. Shall we wind up now?
Yeah,
Because
yeah. If
yeah,
there's
yeah.
nothing else.
Yeah, because questions can wait till Monday if at all they have to kind of,
Okay.
attend this session again. Yeah. So, Raj, once again, thank you very much for very
My
informative
pleasure. My pleasure. I hope I've
session.
answered everybody's questions to the best of their satisfaction.
Yes, yes, Raj, certainly. I can guarantee you that. And we
Okay.
also have feedback system mechanism where we run a collaborative summary document where whoever has participated in the webinar shares their, understanding of the session. So
Okay.
probably on Monday, and that is what partly Dipti did in the beginning. She
Yeah.
took a review of that collaborative summary and shared it at the beginning. So on Monday again we will do that, so that if at all there are any questions or any doubts, those could be answered right at the beginning of the session on Monday. Yeah,
Okay. Fine.
yeah. So thank you, Raj. Thank you very much, and
Yeah. Thanks.
wish you a
Thanks.
very pleasurable weekend.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. So, dear all, thank you very much for joining us. I request you to log off so that I can stop the recording of this webinar. Thank you very much for joining us, and I'll send you the link on Monday for a fresh webinar. Thank you very much.